And so one of the first things I thought through the pandemic is, oh, there's definitely going to be a new category that is going to have to pop up to solve learning, just like what we're doing right now.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have Mercedes Bent here, who is a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. And she focuses on investments in consumer, fintech, and EdTech and future of work. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the EdTech space, and she has an awesome presentation prepared for all of us. And then we're going to move into Q&A. So please get all of your questions ready. We're really excited to have her here as a speaker and learn a little more about EdTech. So Mercedes, please take it away. Thanks again for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having me and nice to meet you all. I will start sharing my screen. And essentially today, I thought it would be great to talk a little bit about my focus on EdTech and some of the frameworks I use to think about it, as well as some of the trends I've been following recently in this space. As you guys all know, this has been a very, very interesting year for EdTech with the pandemic. It's like all the things we've been talking about that would happen are finally all happening at once. And so we've made a couple investments this year, 3 different investments in EdTech, and it's a really exciting sector. And before I dive a bit into that as well, also wanted to share a little bit about Lightspeed. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with us. Lightspeed's a venture capital firm. We're based in the Bay Area. Also, we have offices in India, China, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And we are investing in the US out of a 4 billion, well, several funds that are about 4 billion right now, early stage, growth stage. We start around $3 million. We do go up to 100, $150 million, pretty much anything until IPO. And yeah, we do all the same stuff you would expect for any of the big VCs. We do healthcare, bio, fintech. We'll talk a little bit about EdTech since the pandemic. And as I mentioned, talked a little bit about Lightspeed. My areas at Lightspeed, I focus on fintech, EdTech, and consumer. Within fintech, I've been focusing on credit-focused neobanks. So basically companies starting new credit cards. And I've been focusing on social investing or just retail investing in general. Um, EdTech, I've made a couple of investments, including one I'll talk about on the next page. And consumer's broad, but you can focus on really anything in consumer as well. And then I do seed through Series B, and I focus on LATAM as well. And I also lead the Scouts program at Lightspeed. That's a program where we invest check sizes that are $25,000 to $50,000. And prior to coming to Lightspeed, I spent the last a little over a decade. I started out my career working at the Federal Reserve during the last recession. Worked for, it was in the Boston Fed trying to figure out what had happened during the mortgage crisis. Also worked for the DC Fed. Then I switched over to Goldman. So did a couple of years there, decided I was done with my corporate finance career in 2012. I left to join General Assembly and started out doing, when they were just raising, I think it was just after their Series A, and helped grow that company from about 2 million in revenue to 100 million in revenue. It was a really fun ride to just see all the different, ways we expanded, all the different products we launched, the enterprise division. It was a really great experience. And I was a GM leading a couple of their divisions. I led their full-time division and their university division. And then after that, went to run revenue at a virtual reality startup, and then started getting into investing after that. First did impact investing with Stanford, briefly did some EdTech investing with Al Ventures, and then came here to Lightspeed. So that's a little bit about my background and story. I was born in North Carolina, grew up most of my time in California, and I live in California now. So that's me. This is our EdTech portfolio at Lightspeed. I have it in this kind of funny looking image because I think of it as a lifelong learning journey where we start with K-12 and you go on to, high school and career mobility, college, higher education, corporate learning. We have, in a couple of these companies we just invested in this year, Forage is a Series A that I led earlier this year. What they do is they're a career discovery network that helps employers create courses about what it's like to work at that employer. FlockJ, we invested in after YC, but we just participated in the Series A this year. They're a sales training boot camp, so very similar to kind of what I was doing at GA, but they have a bigger kind of jobs marketplace focus. And then we also this summer invested in OutSchool. They're a K through 12 live online marketplace for kids to learn, all sorts of things, but really driven by teachers who are looking to unleash their creativity. And there's a bunch of other ones in here. This is Handshake, White Hat out of London, apprenticeship focused, Better Up, the corporate kind of coaching platform. So, and Terminal Eightfold focusing on recruitment, hiring, Byju's out of India, now the most valuable EdTech private company in the world. So a couple of different exciting ones in our portfolio. So first to start off, just in terms of the kind of 30,000 foot view, this is just how I think about education. Anytime someone's telling me, hey, I'm looking at something or I'm trying to understand the ed tech landscape, if they're just starting out, I say, okay, are we talking like early childhood education? That's what EC is, ECE, early childhood education. Are we talking more of the K through 12 side? Or are we talking more of the post-secondary side? And post-secondary is everything university or college onwards. And this is where historically there's been a lot more investment from the venture capital sector. There was a kind of perception prior to the pandemic, I would say, and in a bunch of circles that, K-12 is really hard to invest in because a lot of the companies that you were investing in were basically had the business model of doing B2B school SaaS, where they were selling things into school districts. And we all know how difficult that can be. They have one kind of opening purchase cycle per year. So that could be tough for folks. I personally have always loved both sides, K through 12 and post-secondary, but I've spent probably more of my last 8 years in education focused on the post-secondary side. And this year, 2020, due to the pandemic, is the first time that I'm spending much more of my time in K-12, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. I also wanted to highlight this. People talk a lot about the future of work, and I think there's two camps of the future of work. There's a future of work that talks about collaboration, productivity tools, Slack, Teams, all of that. Like, how do we actually do the work and the software? And there's another camp that when they say it, what they're actually referring to is, education and training programs, and how do we prepare people to be workers, and how do we prepare them for a state in the future where jobs are automated, and so we don't need as much we don't need, potentially maybe we don't even need people working in jobs, and how do we ensure that there is still something for people to do. So that's kind of the future of workers side. I have a thesis around the future of workers that jobs in the past were much more, and this is going back to like the 50s, 60s. So this is kind of, basic coverage of older stuff, but jobs used to be, you sign up for IBM, you sign up for Microsoft, you work there, or maybe General, Procter and Gamble, you work there for 25, 30 years and you rise the ranks. And you go through several of these processes, before of these kind of parts of being a worker before you retire. Today, they say the average millennial, and I don't even know what they're saying for Gen Z, but the average number of different careers that we'll have in our lifetime is something like 5 different separate careers that don't have anything to do with one another. And so we're having to get much better at having smaller circular journeys where we get really good at one thing and then we have to move on to something else. I did corporate finance for several years and then abandoned that. And then I did, startup operations for several years and abandoned that. And now I'm into venture. So I'm kind of on my third career. And each of these has been a very, very much so a process where it's a new circular career journey that I've had to make transition points each time. And so there's a lot of startups in supporting this space now. This is a Medium article. This comes from a Medium article I wrote. If anyone wants to check it out, it's just called The Future of Workers, and put together, I think this was like a year ago that I wrote this, a little bit of a market map in terms of who are a bunch of the companies serving this space. So that was the kind of background frameworks. And I wanted to spend the rest of the time talking today about where we headed now. after the pandemic started. So, like any good VC, in May, I wrote some predictions about where I thought things might be headed. One focused on the kind of K-12 side, and one focused on the post-secondary side. So this was a fun opportunity to kind of go back and, as I was putting this together, grade myself, so to speak, and see what came true and what didn't. Now, and it's some of them are still TBD since we're only 9 months or so into the pandemic. So on the K-12 side, some of the stuff that I was looking at, and some of the things that certainly came true were around just I mean, the K-12 sector was so fundamentally transformed. Everyone's working from home, learning from home. All of the K-12 system was not ever stress tested in this capacity before. Parents having to take on taking care of their kids, managing their work and their kids. I don't have to tell you guys this, all of these things, but there were some things that I think we're still yet to see. There's really a lot of learning loss right now in K-12 in terms of there's the normal kind of path that you would move students along year to year isn't happening for a lot of students. And so I think you have to wonder how are they going to make that up? Are they just going to flunk every student and say you can't, a third of students, maybe a quarter of students, and say you can't move on to the next grade? Or are they going to try and assess students in a different way? The main way that most students are assessed, in addition to passing, getting a passing grade, is by seat but hours, essentially. If you've heard of the Carnegie hours, credit hours is the amount of time that you spent in school. With so many students not actually having enough attendance to count for being able to pass on to the next grade, this is a big question that's still outstanding that I honestly haven't seen really, really great solutions for yet. So this is this third one I'm referring to, competency, based education. And that's a potential solution that some people have started using, but it hasn't really been widespread yet. So, and just moving to and we can come back to this, feel free when we do Q&A, if anyone can ask me questions about this, or if you have questions as we're going, feel free to ask as well. On the higher education side, I think some of the things we've still yet to see is the fallout from colleges. How many of them will close or consolidate? What are all of the people who have been deferring college going to be doing the next few years? There's still a lot to be seen here. I think that some of the interesting things we have seen is that there just has been a ton of pressure on the college tuition and also on the value of degrees. So sorry, I don't have time to go through all, I guess 17 of these, but we'll go through a couple of more in depth in a second now. So one of the predictions I was looking at was about homeschooling. When the pandemic first started, it was obvious, okay, people are going to be learning from home. The question is, are they going to get used to this new habit of having their kids at home? And is this something that they'll want to stick? Homeschooling historically has been accounted for about 3% of the population. Private school accounts for about 7 to 8%, and charter school students account for about 5%, and the rest of the students in the country are all in public school. So one of the big things I was wondering is whether or not that would actually, increase. I think one of the most important things that has happened out of K through 12 is that parents are fundamentally reconsidering what it means to go to school. And, for all the research that we've done in terms of the Gates Foundation and, Pearson and all of these big players who've looked at the school system for a very long time, and we've measured, what is the most effective way to teach, what is the most effective way to coach teachers so that they can be more effective. One of the fundamental questions that's never really been researched, I was talking to somebody at the Gates Foundation, is whether or not the structure of the school itself is what is best helps learning. And I think this is something that parents are really starting to question right now. This stat here that almost 40% of parents said they disenrolled their child in going into this fall school year from the school they were at prior into some other type of learning experience is really, really, really huge. I mean, this is the largest shift in US K through 12 schooling choices since basically the 18 or maybe even 1700s, probably the early 1800s when we formalized what school actually was, which is okay, kids go to a schoolhouse and they have grades and they move from there to there. The charter school movement wasn't anywhere near this big. Number of students going to private school isn't nearly as big. This is really groundbreaking stuff. And so what we're seeing in EdTech is that there's a ton of startups now answering this kind of shift that we're seeing. On the right here are a couple of just a few, there's many, many more, but just a few of the companies that are part of the quote unquote micro school category that are starting to serve these parents and say, hey, yeah, there is another option other than public school, other than private school, other than charter schools. You can have, like with Prenda, what they do is you can have small pods of 10 students at your home, and, you can teach them from, for half of the day. And if you weren't planning to work anyway, they're kind of positioning this as moms who were stay at home can now have a side job as well. You'll be able to make extra income, but it's not a traditional school in that they're not now, stuck grading papers all afternoon. And so some of the bigger players also, jumped into this pool of this micro school pool. Wonder School launched a offering. They're a daycare education provider, and they started offering a program, Swing Education, which does substitute teachers is their primary service for public schools and private schools. They started offering a new program called Bubbles, and then a bunch of other startups sprung up. Ilk, Prisma, Schoolhouse, they're all micro school focused. Sora does online high school, and Primer and Co-Learn Club are maybe a little bit closer to homeschool SaaS, but they are also focused on, they're all oriented towards trying to solve the problem of how do we help parents who want a different schooling experience. So, you guys have all heard the term pandemic pods, learning pods. It became a very, very popular term this summer. And I think where we want to watch this sector, this, particular trend over the next couple of months is there's a couple of things. One, like, how are the states going to all respond to this? There are about right now, I want to say 34 or 38 states that have regulation that is favorable for micro schools, and there's a lot of others that do not. It's also become in many ways a very politicized subject, which is interesting, in that the charter school movement of the 90s was not nearly as politicized. It was had a kind of a lot of bipartisanship support. But this time around, we are seeing that, particularly with the strength of the teacher unions, that there's a lot of pushback from blue states on the micro school movement. So New York recently passed laws that make it make it illegal for schools to be micro schools of more than, I think it was 3 or 4 students, to be operating. So really interesting stuff we'll see here over the next couple of months. I mean, a big question is who becomes the DOE head, the Department of Education. I Unless I missed something on CNN, I haven't seen who that person has been, who's been named that role quite yet. But I do think that's a really interesting category to watch. The next one I wanted to chat a little bit about is this trend. One of the things I had wrote in May was this kind of just description of what I thought would be a new category of verticalized education software. You guys are all probably familiar with LMSs, right? Learning management systems. Yes, no? I'm not seeing any thumbs up, but all learning management systems are are systems like Canvas or Moodle or Blackboard. They're essentially systems of record that allow teachers to communicate with their students. You guys have probably used them in one of your education experiences since they've been around for the last 30 years or so. And while they have their use, and in many ways they're more of a file storage system, and they're not optimized for remote learning and live instruction online. And so one of the first things I thought through the pandemic is, oh, there's definitely going to be a new category that is going to have to pop up to solve learning, just like what we're doing right now. And you guys, all know Zoom and how big they've grown. And this number is actually quite a bit outdated. I think this number that Zoom having over 100,000 schools using their platform, I think that number was from, I want to say like August or September. I believe there are well over 130,000 now. And there might be over 150,000. So they've really been growing a lot. And that might not sound like many schools, but for context, there's 130,000 schools total in the United States. So while they don't have 100% market share, of course, in the US, that just shows how many people they do have around the world. And it's their largest vertical. So, Zoom hired a team of 50 salespeople to go after the education opportunity. And they hired a woman, Anne, who used to work at Blackboard for many years, who is now running that team. So they're really putting a lot of effort on it. And if, a company that big is putting a lot of effort into it, you know that there's something's going to happen. So that's some of the backdrop. And then, okay, so who are the companies that have now stepped up to try to serve this space? A bunch of them are on the right here, and you guys can see these two articles below as well. I would say these two are potentially, maybe the quote unquote leaders of the pack. They all do something slightly different. Engagely and Class EDU maybe competing most head to head. In Class for Zoom or Class EDU, they work on top of Zoom, so they actually, the same experience we have now, but with a bunch of additional features that are optimized for learning. So if someone wants to raise their hand, for example, there's quite a number of us on this Zoom call right now, but I can only see 5 people. And so how do I know who's raised their hand or who wants to talk, or is everybody following along, or, are people falling behind? Do they want to go back to something that I talked about? They have a bunch of different features so that students can actually press and comment and give feedback real time to the teachers about what they're seeing. There's kind of a whole, portal off to the left where they can see, and you guys can go look at their website and everything. They have screenshots of what it looks like on there. But I think this is a really interesting play because rather than try to build a standalone platform where you have to convince schools to adopt this whole new thing, they're really going for a platform play. A lot of the bigger educational successes over the last 2 decades have sold in the kind of OEM model where they sell on top of Google Chrome or they sell on top of Apple, and they are applications that are packaged together and sold with it. And I think this is the 21st century version of that, which is that, or maybe the 20s version of it, where they're packaged on top of something they already have. Now, the big probably kind of problem here is that Zoom is banned by a lot of schools. You guys probably remember back in the beginning of COVID, there was some of the security threats, people being able to log in and I think they called it Zoom bombing. And so there's a lot of schools that actually don't allow Zoom. So I do think what I'm looking at is there an opportunity for one of these players to work with Microsoft Teams or work with Google Chrome? I mean, large education software that is already in every single school. Well, Teams is not, but Google Classroom is in pretty much every single school in the country. And could one of these players or somebody new partner up with them to do what Class for Zoom did with Zoom, or Class EDU did with Zoom? And just to talk about a couple of the others here, Engagely is doing a standalone platform. That's the team. Daphne Kohler, one of the co-founders of Coursera, is involved in this as an advisor. Her partner is the CEO. Aula is doing a little bit less of live instruction, but more focused on a learning management system where the teacher has to do much, much less work on lesson planning. Nooks is coming out of Stanford. They're focused on making really the community experience really, really robust. Rafter is a little bit more focused on helping less live instruction as well, but or maybe no live instruction, but once again, more community features, chat-based features for campuses. And then Campus Wire is probably most similar to Class EDU and Engagely. They have live instruction features and are operating in the higher education system primarily. I don't believe they're in K through 12, whereas these two are going after both, although Engagely is also more higher education focused. So that's just a couple. There's probably many, many more players in the space, but just wanted to highlight a few. The third trend I wanted to deep dive a little bit on was the um, something super fascinating that is the main reason why I have been spending so much time in K through 12 since the pandemic started is that for the first time, parents in the US are really pulling out their pocketbooks for education. I mean, we're not a country like Korea or China or maybe some of the other Asian countries where parents historically have spent a very large percentage of their discretionary income on their child's education. That's just not something we did. I think our averages pre-pandemic were like 1 to 2% of discretionary income goes to children's education. And that was mostly athletics and, other kind of school related materials. Um, Contrast that to Asia, where parents are frequently spending 25%, 30% of discretionary income on tutors and supplemental content and after school learning and weekend learning and camps and just all of these different things that is we're not in our culture. But really, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think parents were reckoned with, wow, the system we historically relied on, the public school system, isn't necessarily working right now. So, how are we going to fill the gap? And so many companies that are, over here on the right, and some of these are language focused companies, Busu and Cambly, but they also saw a big uptick. Um, so many of these companies saw a huge surge of paid users where they were saying, hey, we know that most of these players are not offering core aligned content, core aligned being, the in K through 12, the way the content is either described as core or as supplemental. Supplemental means it doesn't count for passing the grade, and core means it does count towards essentially the state test and passing the grade. So most of these players offer supplemental content, but and there's probably a much better explanation of what I just described, but hopefully it's good enough to get across the concept. But despite that, parents said there were a couple of reasons that parents are pulling out their pocketbook. One is the reason that I talked about before, which is that we need more, we are fearful that our students have too much learning loss. They used to go to school for 7 hours and have all this content. Now I'm seeing, them maybe log in for 30 minutes to 1 hours with their teacher and not have anything else to do all day. They're falling behind. Two, a second reason is actually school provided a really necessary function for many parents, which is daycare. And now they don't have that. And so how do I have my child occupied while I need to also be doing things? And so a lot of these programs, which have a live component to them, OK Play, Outschool, Caribou, Six Crickets, they were able to now be kind of a babysitter in some ways for their children. So this is just once again a huge, huge, huge shift in the way that budgets work. And as a VC with my VC hat on, it was like, oh wow, K-12 is exciting all of a sudden in terms of there's ways to make money that don't rely on selling into school districts once a year, where school districts typically pay pretty low. I mean, the average, per student price on the supplemental uh, curricula is maybe up to $10 a student max. And given there's 50 million students, that's, a $500 million sales opportunity max. So it's difficult to build, multi-billion dollar companies versus, okay, parents are paying $10 for, less than an hour of content. And if say if so it's live online like OutSchool, so that obviously you can see how the market size is much, much bigger when we're talking about parent spend versus school spend. So that's just something that's been a really fundamental shift. TBD on how long it lasts, but also just wanted to highlight Byju's, which does come out of India. So not talking about the US now, but I mean, similar to most of these, Baiju saw a huge, huge surge in the number of students using their platform over the pandemic. Baiju started out in India as, you could kind of describe it as test prep, kind of like academic content that helped demystify academic subjects. A lot of it started with math originally. Now they do all sorts of things with visual conceptualization, and yeah, they're just huge now. They're the largest privately held ed tech company by market cap. So happy to come back to this to discuss as well. The last thing the last trend I wanted to quickly cover is more on the higher education side. So the first three were more K through 12, but in this one I actually don't know the what startups are really coming out of this yet. I put this page, this little graphic here from CB Insights, and I'll talk about that in a second. But most of the companies they have on here have existed pre-pandemic. So in terms of what's really new in the last 6 to 9 months, I'm still waiting for that to be seen. But basically, we all know that the question that for many years people have been questioning the value of higher education. You're probably familiar with the concept of unbundling the university, breaking apart its different components. And that's something that at graduate school has been really affected the last 15 years. And it's starting to creep into the undergraduate system as well now. There were stats like 20% of Harvard's first year class deferred, which is huge. Tuition prices at universities had the slowest increase in 30 years. Normally, tuition outpaces inflation by at least 2x, somewhere 4 to 8% per year has been the average over the last 20, 30 years, which is just mind blowing if you think about how fast tuition grows. But this year it finally stopped, which tells you something. If a price is not going up and suddenly it's because it's all remote, okay, what was the value of that price of that good? And then also another big trend has been that increasingly over the last few decades, a lot of graduate school enrollment has been from overseas. A lot of the universities need this because overseas students are more likely to pay full price. They don't have access to the financial aid, don't always have access to scholarships or grants, and so they're a steady supply of closer to full price paying students. And this year, the stat that this isn't for all international students, but for incoming international students, so people starting their first year, the enrollment was down 43%. That's huge. I mean, all of these changes we're talking about, I keep saying this is huge and this is groundbreaking, but it really is. There's a lot of interesting things happening right now. So my question for this is, okay, where are people spending their time if they're deferring going to, freshman year, if they're deferring going to graduate school, if internationals aren't coming over, are they, what types of choices, what type of schooling are they enrolling in, or are they just not doing school at all? So TBD on that. I mean, obviously platforms like Udemy, Udacity, Coursera are seeing huge surges this year, so that might be part of the answer. But in different from the first three categories I talked about, I haven't necessarily seen a class of startups that has been codified that is serving this space yet. Curious to hear your guys' thoughts if you do feel you are. So then in terms of where I'm looking at now, where I'm going from here, there's a couple of different trends. We talked about micro schools already. We talked about verticalized education software. I still think there's a lot to be played out here. And I told you a little bit about and number 5, I talked about consumer models. So those, I'm still watching where all of those will go. The other 3, I just want to quickly highlight. Something interesting that's also happening recently is that large consumer education companies have recently launched, and recently, like the last year or so, but a trend I'm noticing is that they were waiting a very long time to launch their enterprise arm. And so, for example, Udemy, they launched their enterprise division last about a year ago. And at that point, they were already huge, hundreds of millions of learners on the consumer side. And so the benefit was that when they finally decided to launch an enterprise offering, this was reported in the press, they were able to go from 0 to 100 million ARR in about a year, which is just like super fast if you think about how long it takes any typical SaaS company to go 0 to 100 million. I mean, normally an education SaaS company is going to take about 5 years to get there if it's doing the best. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's the power of the brand that they've built on the consumer side. There isn't really much question for all of these people they're selling into, and they already have built-in users who they can walk into companies and say, "Hey, we already have tons of your users using our site, or of your employees using our site." So that's a really interesting trend. Coursera has also been speeding ahead on their enterprise offering as a result of this. Um, I'll talk about number four and then end on number two. Number four, authoritative credentials. I think one thing I've always, been curious is if the degree is really truly to unbundle, then, and the idea being that like a bachelor's degree doesn't really clarify what your actual skills are. It kind of says, okay, you might know something about this subject, but how do you get micro badging and kind of digital, more micro credentials to convey actual skill sets? It's been a pipe dream for a really long time in EdTech. And I think the issue has always been whether or not you can trust people who put together the credentials. There's, Google certifications for some of their programs. We've seen a lot that have come out. Salesforce has obviously theirs for their Salesforce admins. We've seen a lot of corporate driven certifications over time. And while those have value, they're very difficult to translate those into industry wide, explanate certifications of anything broader than what they do with that company, because people aren't going to trust it. It's like, okay, I know Google makes more money if there's more, Google for developer certificates are out there. Salesforce makes more money if there's more Salesforce admin certificates out there. So you can't really say Salesforce is going to judge all salespeople or Google is going to judge all engineers. You need an independent, authoritative body to be able to actually add some of that transparency and credibility to the credentials. And just recently, I've started to see a couple of really interesting startups coming together that are doing this. One is called Workera, and they're working with Andrew Ng's artificial intelligence organization and body. And so that might be interesting. There's a couple of others, but I do think that I'm starting to see players come out and rather than go to market with a revenue driven, well, they do make money, but rather than go to market where they had some other offering and then they tack on a certification, they're making the certification the first and only offering, and they're partnering with an independent industry third party association to give it some of that credibility. So we'll see where that goes. And then, yeah, the last thing is just social and community driven learning experiences. I'm seeing so many founders think about this, and it's a huge gap. It's, like, why do we not have a community driven feature on Masterclass? Like, it's already an edutainment experience. It seems like we should have a way to communicate with one another about this topic.
I want to give a quick round of applause. I thought that was one of the most information-packed deep dives, one of the deepest deep dives we've had in quite a while. So thank you so much, Mercedes. That was fantastic. Carolyn, I know you have a question. I would love some more questions from more people. Please post them so then we can ask them. I have some myself, but I can save them to the end and get some fellows first. So Carolyn, if you want to ask yours.
Thanks, Shreya, and thanks, Mercedes, so much for your talk. This is really helpful. So I'm actually in EIR right now, working with a university that has a mixed reality platform to teach anatomy. And it's basically built. They're just thinking about how to commercialize it. And I was curious on your thoughts on mixed reality or virtual reality, all those type of things for post-secondary education. Do you think this is going to take off? Less so? What are your thoughts?
That's a great question. And this is a space I spent several years looking at. There is something somewhere on the web. I wrote something called like top VR and AR players in education. I think it's from 2017 because I used to work in the VR industry. I think that okay, so first off, I think that VR and XR as a technology has a ton of potential. And it's definitely been through kind of the highs of highs, the lows of lows. It's been a little bit in the trough of disillusionment for a few years now. So while I'm very bullish on the technology and its power, it has structural limitations, primarily being that the most high fidelity experiences require pretty expensive hardware that is still not readily available and is still not 100% comfortable for a lot of people. Um, you can view XR, VR on much more low fidelity, low cost, devices, but then you're just not getting as good of an experience out of it. So at that point, you might as well be, I personally think I might as well be watching a 2D video if I'm going to watch, an experience on a mobile VR device, because I don't think they're quite as good. Now the latest Quest are getting better and better, but that's one thing about the technology. Two, that said, there are some companies, specifically, I think because of the pandemic and in science topics where labs are shut down due to COVID for learning purposes, that are seeing some big surges right now. There's a company called Labster that just raised, I think, another round. And, it makes sense because we have this COVID shutdown right now. I don't know if the thing that I would watch in terms of intersection is, as COVID goes down, people have the vaccines. Does the hardware get to a better place in a time frame that they kind of cross over each other? That's what I would watch out for. So I think it has promise. I'm just not sure if the timing's gonna work out.
Thank you.
Mercedes, I would love to ask you, you had a slide where you talked about kind of which predictions were right and wrong. And one of them was like healthcare focused boot camps exploding in popularity. I believe, did I read that correctly? It was like, why do you think that didn't happen, given that there was obviously increased demand for healthcare workers and one could expect that a lot of people would want to transition it?
Yeah, I don't entirely know why it hasn't necessarily happened. There are a couple of companies, MedCerts, Osmosis, that are doing healthcare education, and there's specific brands that only focus on, those subjects. And they did grow. They did grow some, but I thought it would be, kind of like the coding boot camps of 2012, 2013, 2014, where there were a ton that started with a lot of fanfare, a lot of funding. Maybe it's because that model has been, proven to be difficult to run. But given that clearly we already had a shortage of healthcare workers. We're going to need more after this pandemic, and the brand awareness for people who are looking for new jobs of healthcare as a steady field to have or a good field to have a steady job in. It seems like those factors should align, but no, I don't fully know why. Yeah, there haven't been as many yet.
Yeah, sometimes things don't shake out like we expect. Gideon, I'd love to have you ask your question.
Hi, I was actually thinking about, because I was speaking with some friends a few hours ago, and then I would like to know your thoughts on like using distributed ledger technology, which is like blockchain, essentially on credentials, right, to make certificates using blockchain, so that people can literally know that it's true and it's real and it works, or something like that. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there have been some people who've worked on that solution. I think that I haven't dived super deep into it. I think that for the average everyday American, but the average everyday American still doesn't understand blockchain. So it's going to have difficulty taking over as a system of record from, the university degree and the schools that send out your transcript, if it's not well understood by the public yet in terms of like how to access it, how to use it, all of that. But I think that there are ed tech companies that are put together to solve it. And so that's the education threshold they're going to have to get over in terms of working with schools and convincing them to partner together.
Yeah.
That's my only fear.
Yeah, so from what I understand, it means that like the bottleneck here is one, the education, and also the fact that it's not really usable, right? So like companies that solve those problems essentially have a way there, right?
Essentially have a what?
Like they have a path to the market or to being successful or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll ask my question. Please, more people post your questions so that it's not just me. But I feel like I've seen a lot of things that said, "Oh, homeschooling is exploding," and I just didn't understand how that was possible. Because if a ton of people got laid off, to like a ton of parents, presumably, they have less money, and don't they need to find another source of income rather than actually have like the time and space to homeschool their children now? Or is it like a 2-income household who now is 1 income and is like, doesn't have as much, but they don't really have access to childcare. So one parent, often the mom, will now be taking care of the kids all day. So might as well also homeschool them. So there's more control over their education. Like, I just don't understand how all of the demographic trends converge together to make homeschooling a viable option for many households.
I think it's an interesting question. I think one of the data points that we're seeing is that women are leaving the workforce more permanently because of the pandemic. And so while there are people who are looking for, okay, how do I get, what's going to be my next job? How do I go back? A lot of times in recessions, and specifically in this recession, because it so much is combining not just economic loss, but the combination of childcare and its struggles against economic opportunity. People are more and more women. The rate of people who have permanently left the workforce has increased. And so that's, I believe, some of the explanation, not all of it, for homeschooling. And then also just to this, I saw in the chat, Cameron, about the regulations in healthcare. And I do think that when I talk about a healthcare boot camp, I am thinking about lower level roles that you don't need a formal degree for. So the allied healthcare space, medical assistants, those type of roles, but completely agree with you for RNs, MDs. It's probably not something that boot camps can easily do. But there are some starting to partner with traditional universities. I've seen 1 or 2. They just haven't grown large yet.
In a little different direction, Sebastian, you want to ask yours?
Yeah, totally. So first off, awesome presentation. Big fan of a lot of the interesting points you made. I think one interesting question is, there might be a trade-off between building for the US versus other markets. I feel like in places like the US, most people see education as a cost, or only a small minority think of it as an investment. In a place like Asia, I think a lot more people think of it as something you invest in to have a better future. So what are your thoughts like on the upsides and downsides of building in other countries like in Asia, maybe Latin America or Europe?
I don't follow EdTech outside of the US super closely, so I'm not familiar with every market. It is a very popular expansion idea for kind of Series C and D US companies right now to expand to India, and vice versa. A lot of Indian companies are coming to the US. We have shared language, and I think it's something where people see, especially from the India coming to the US, a bit of a arbitrage opportunity to utilize some of the supply of teachers in India and get the prices of American education. That's the corridor where I've seen the most interaction over the last couple of months. every growth stage, Series C or D company said, we're going to go to India as our next, strategy. And so, can't believe all of them. It probably won't work out for a lot of folks, but it is working for some players. Coursera has had a large expansion there. Still probably not as big as what they wanted long term, but yeah. Sorry, I can't answer for all of the geos.
Yeah, totally makes sense.
Arpit?
Yeah. Hey, Mercedes, this was awesome. Curious on the education spectrum, how do you think about kind of opportunities in the life skills space, like money, finance, even like running a side hustle? Like, do you see any unique opportunities that we should think about?
Yeah, I didn't mention this in my talk, but the creator economy for education was a very, very hot topic this summer. I personally didn't pay too much attention to it because I think it's been around for a long time and hasn't been successful. If you Google, because a lot of people were trying to build platforms and systems for creators to be able to teach content and skills like this. And then there were also separately schools that have tried to teach this type of content, but life skills content as a standalone school can be difficult to sell because people don't necessarily see the value in it or how it helps them get a job. So it can be hard to monetize. So then on the side of people trying to enable creators to teach any type of side hustle content, what was I going to say? If you Google, what's the phrase? Create and sell courses online, you will just see like tons and tons and tons of like pages of Google search results for different companies that allow you to do this. And so there was a period over the summer where I was being pitched like twice a week of someone wanting to start a new one. And I was just like, this is such a fragmented market. I don't know how you're going to stand out. Teachable from a software platform for perspective is pretty big. They've done well. And then from the school side, there is a company called, is it Yellow Dig? I want to say it's Yellow Dig that does like Gen Z. I'm Googling this as I talk. No, it's not Yellow Dig. It's a different one. It's Yellow something. There's a company that does more kind of content focused on the creator economy. Their unique positioning is that they partner with schools like NYU Stern or Parsons to co-create those courses. So at least the student can get a certificate from them, from the school at the end. I'm blanking on the name, Yellow something.
Thanks. Right. Yeah.
Since we only have a few minutes left, I think I want to jump to Carolyn's question because Moaz and Tarek's are a little similar to ones that we've just asked.
Thanks. So I know OnDeck's a great example of community learning, but I'm curious to hear your thought on similar models for folks who are earlier in their careers, because at OnDeck, it's expected that we all have a certain level of experience, right? So for more junior folks, have you seen good kind of community learning models? I know there's this like Gen Z Mafia that I've heard about. Are there other things that you think have been successful?
I haven't heard of Gen Z Mafia. I'm excited to see what that is. I do think that peer-to-peer learning is a really difficult problem to solve. And I don't know when people say community learning, if they actually mean peer-to-peer learning or if they mean maybe something else. I do think that, there's a couple of players who are doing interesting things in peer-to-peer learning. There's a company called Kritik, Kritik, that is, I'll put it in chat. I think it's spelled like this. That is trying to, they have kind of like an enterprise SaaS model. Almost their product is almost look like an LMS. They go to schools and what they've built is a way to incentivize peer-to-peer learning through their software, where grades, like every single thing that the teacher inputs into the system in terms of the rubric or an assignment or, hey, upload your stuff here, people can comment on the assignment or the rubric itself and edit it and send it back. And so it's very meta. And the goal is to get the students to constantly question every aspect of their learning and say, well, actually, like, is the rubric supposed to be this? Or you gave us this assignment, but should it have been this? Or, and they can comment on each other's, assignments and back and forth. So it's a very formal, structured way to incentivize and force community driven learning, but it does it in a way that helps the teacher, takes down a lot of the cost of putting together lesson plans, and it increases for college students the engagement with their professors significantly, so professors like it. So that's one very far field example. Another example is a company called Next. I want to believe. Let me Google this. I believe it's called Nexford Academy, Nexford University. Nope, sorry, it's Noon Academy, or Noon Academy. They're based out of the Middle East. Yeah, okay, Noon Academy. It looks like this. And they are based out of the Middle East. They're a social learning platform. They're not a full university replacement, but in terms of the depth they've gone from a consumer perspective, the number of features they've added, it's hard to describe without like seeing the inside of their system. Maybe download their app or look for images and screenshots online of what they've done. But they've gone really, really deep on the number of features of how to allow, at like the scale of millions of users, how to get them commenting and interacting with each other. And so that's a really interesting example.
Thanks. And just to clarify, Gen Z Mafia is probably not as much of an education thing, more a development, but I'll pop it in if anyone's interested.
Awesome. All right, we are right at time. So thank you very much.